Interesting. I mean, I can relate to some of that. I think for me, getting exposed to architecture came from my mum, and I guess but my dad as well, where they were both doctor, well, they both are doctors, and I think they had that kind of immigrant mentality of like, you got to go for the high jobs, you got to go for medicine, you got to go for architecture, the STEM stuff, and that's how you succeed. So I had that kind of upbringing, which I think a lot of people from, I guess, my background or similar background have. What was it like for you? Because you're saying that it was just kind of on the tip of everyone's tongue. Architecture is this thing which everybody will think of when it comes to a profession. But in terms of what motivated you to get in, what was that factor? Was it, you said, an art teacher? Did it have something to do with that?
I mean, I think people like that art teacher were ones that sort of showed me that it was a potential pathway. But I think all of the motivation to do it just came from a desire to work in a way that was both creative and making sort of changes to public life, to like cities, to physical, like built environment, in make positive changes to that. So I think it was that combination of like, I enjoy this, I enjoy like doing this, I enjoy the subject, I enjoy learning about it, and it's something that can improve other people's lives. So that I think that overlap was the kind of the hook for pre-university me.
See, I asked this question to like loads of people. I've asked it to loads of students, and there's always that similar thread of like, I get to do something creative, I get to do something artistic, but then I also get to do something super rational or something that can change people's lives. And I just wonder, like, how much of that do we actually know as kids? Like, part of me just thought on a surface level, I guess it depends on how early you get exposed to the field, right? But for me, like growing up, it was just like, oh, I get to do something that is really artsy, but then it's also kind of sciencey. So it's a strange one to think about. I feel like there's no straightforward, typical route into architecture that people talk about. And I think there's a lot of criticism, and I've heard you talk about, certain aspects of the field where it's not accessible to certain people. And it's not easy to kind of progress through the education system. We're going to get really deep into that because you've written some amazing articles about topics on that. But don't you think that there is a big variation in the way people get exposed to architecture? The routes in which to get into architecture are extremely varied as well. I mean, my experience personally was I did a foundation course in art and design, and then I kind of fell into architecture after a bit of a negotiation deal with my dad on the phone, where I said I wanted to go to film school, and he was like, "Well, if you want some help with money, then go to architecture school." So it was like effortless, and it
Right.
was it was almost an accident that I ended up in architecture school. And being a guy who people like, say, oh, when we talk about inclusivity, we talk about race and ethnicity. So people say, for brown people, or for for black people, or any minority ethnic group, the route into architecture is very difficult. I personally found that difficult to understand, given that my experience was almost this effortless accident.
Mm.
What do you say about that?
Things like systemic barriers, things like, you know, privilege, they are fundamentally very, very complicated topics. And I think people like to find easy ways of understanding and rationalizing them, because they're very like emotionally distressing when you learn about these things, when you learn that these things are real, because there's that almost like primal part of your brain that's just saying like, this isn't fair, and this not being fair makes me upset. So you want to rationalize it as sort of succinctly as possible. So, you know, for some people it will become race. Like for some people, it will become class. For some people, it's gender. And the thing is that usually they're all right. Like there's no one like axis where you can sort of map out systemic exclusion, because it works along all these axes. So you might be a black person, but you might be a man, which gives you sort of slightly more systemic privilege than a woman. You also might be incredibly wealthy, which that will also give you a huge amount of advantages. And so you, as a rich black man, might not feel that systemic oppression based on race is a real thing because you've not experienced it. But it's just because the axes at which you exist, you're still in a relatively privileged position. You still will inevitably suffer, bigotry, and you'll still feel a different lived experience than, say, a white person would. But you still have privilege in the sense of financial resources and gender, for example. So I think the reason why we so often hear people talk about how like systemic exclusion, systemic oppression doesn't align with their personal experience of the world is because people tend to fixate on one of those axes rather than seeing it as a cross factor thing. It's intersectional is the word I was trying to think of. Intersectional is the word that people use when they're trying to talk about these issues from a sort of larger, more zoomed out viewpoint, because this intersectionality is what allows you to align with or not align with the values and prejudices of a system that you're trying to gain entrance into.
Right. I suppose in many ways, well, I've known you for a while now, and I've kind of followed the whole journey of, and what was started off as an Instagram poll on your account, and then became a massive campaign to cause major changes to the field of architecture by the looks of it. But I've also seen your attitude and your level of, dare I say it, maturity kind of develop with regards to this issue. I've seen the way in which you've become, I mean, I will admit from my perspective, I feel like you've become more balanced in your views as well, in terms of how you see the broader picture. And I think what you just explained is a result of that probably intense kind of rate of knowledge kind of being thrown at you because of the success of this campaign and the campaigns you've run in general. And I love that idea of saying, look, sometimes you need to step back and you need to look at it in the broader picture, because getting really focused into the detail and getting really focused into the kind of surface level, impulsive kind of reactions that people have, and they rightly have, because there are many issues that people feel victimized about, but that is not an accurate way to assess the whole situation. And
yeah, or it's only one part of the picture.
Sure. I think one thing's interesting is you talked about the nuances of, like, I could be a male South Asian, a male British man of South Asian ethnic background. And, I've been told, I spoke to Marsha Ramroop, the inclusivity director, the other day about it, and sort of explained some of the same things I felt. And she said, well, like you said, you could be a person who is more privileged than someone who's in a slightly different subgroup than you. For example, a South Asian British woman, for example, would probably feel more discrimination than I would. But then I also sense and feel that these boundaries, and we're almost kind of creating this hierarchical system ourselves of who is the most oppressed. And that makes me feel kind of uncomfortable to some degree, because, you talked about how these different groups have different levels of discrimination, right? We seldom talk about the subgroups within white ethnicity who also experience some discrimination. And again, speaking from personal perspective here again, even people talking about white privilege, is something that still it still confused me again with my experience, because I grew up around loads of white people, white kids who struggled. They really struggled financially. They struggled class-wise. So, where is the balance, and what have you learned throughout this kind of intense knowledge building process?
Yeah, well, I mean, the term white privilege upsets a lot of people because they immediately interpret it as it meaning that you have no problems. But the way I interpret it is like, for me, white privilege is like, never in my life have I been like heard like a racial slur directed at me, like in public or in my workplace or at school or anything like that. I don't know how many of my black friends can say that. I don't know if any of them can say that. So for me, like, privilege is not to say like, you've got it made, you've got it easy. It just means that you are less likely to experience detrimental treatment because of the color of your skin. Now, yeah, the fact that there's different demographics within white people, that's true as well. Like, if you're an Eastern European in the UK, you're also likely to experience some level of like xenophobia because of your accent or something like that. But that's because like, whiteness as a concept, it's not rooted in like any like fact, right? Like, whiteness is an idea. Like, it's Italians didn't used to be considered white. Like, if we're talking about racism over the last 100 years, Italians didn't used to be considered white. Eastern Europeans didn't used to be considered white. White was considered to be something that was almost reserved to like colonial Western European states. So, whiteness isn't even really like a genetic or a biological thing like we think of it as. It's it's almost like an institution. It's like a colonial legacy that still has impacts today, because all of our governance systems, all of our power structures were all built off of the back of this concept of whiteness. So
I suppose you could say the same thing about blackness and brownness and all of those other groups as well, because at the end of the day, what you're talking about is there's a label that is being put onto an enormous population of people with immense diversity within them. And surely that's not just problematic for white people, but it's problematic in any way you use one word to describe a plethora of types of people.
well, it's just about legacy. Like I said, it's not saying that everything's easy. It's not saying that you've got it made. But in the case of the UK, for example, it does mean that the UK built its wealth through colonialism. It built its wealth through the extraction of value of colonized like nations and people. So it's not about it's not even like a value judgment, or it's not even like saying that all white people are bad or should feel ashamed of that. That's just a fact. Like, that's just what happened. That's how we got here, and that's an important thing to like keep in mind when we talk about power and race today, is that is the context. So, like I said, it's still important to look at the different axes. So class, still hugely important. Gender, still hugely important. Disability, still hugely important. All of these things affect your individual experience of, equity and power in your individual life. But, we are structurally sorted into these groups, like, we have to put down ethnicity in government like in the census. We have to put down gender in the census. Like that's just the way it is. We are sorted into these groups, and so it's no good, as I see it, it's no good pretending that they don't exist, because they do exist. So yeah, one day I would love to live in a post-race, post-gender, everything world, but we're just not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that. I just think in terms of when I say getting rid of the label, I really don't mean in terms of classification of people, but I mean when it comes to making generalized statements about people. I often find, and I didn't want to go into the right and the left discussion because I'm no politics expert, but what I see and what I find is, the left usually, make sweeping statements about racial groups as a way to kind of build unity. And if I speak from my own example again, which is, I belong, let's say, to the minority groups I belong, or the groups I belong. I think I belong to the British group because I primarily identify myself as a British person. I have, and that doesn't make me a minority, that makes me whatever. But further to that, I have, I guess, an identity group of Pakistani. And you could also say, okay, that's a more specific version of South Asians, or the subcontinental group of people in the UK. But then I also have another minority of, let's say, the Muslim identity. Now, with all of those things, I see myself somewhat part of them, but I get really uncomfortable when statements are made by people of power and people of who have got themselves to a position of leadership, if you like, or even people who claim to have the kind of the statements to speak on behalf of these people. And then that gets adopted by, let's say, people who aren't from those ethnic groups. And then it just becomes a very kind of like, just this, a game of like throwing these tribal labels around, and people saying, I speak on behalf of the Muslims and we face this and that. And I speak on behalf of the Black community, for example. And I have friends who have said to me that, I don't feel like there is a monolithic Black community. And in the same way, I don't feel like that there is a Muslim community. So I suppose, how do you deal with not getting rid of these labels, but truly being inclusive in the way people want to be, without making generalizations?
I think there's two things that relate to that. So like one is, I think the kind of campaigning that maybe you're referring to, that you think is too sweeping, or like tends to characterize one ethnicity as like the good guys and one ethnicity as the bad guys, for example. That's what people call identity politics, right? And identity politics is kind of a complicated thing, because it's not wrong. Like there is, like I said, like we spoke about, there are different experiences in a country like the UK with its colonial history for different ethnicities. Like Black people are something like 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people in London, for example. Like that. So, there is a very, very serious aspect of equity that we need to talk about in terms of race, where I think fair criticism of identity politics comes up is when identity, race and gender become the only things that people look at, because then you're missing hugely important factors like class, like disability, all these other things that can sort of give or take privilege in the way that you live your life. So I think that's probably the kind of politics that you're maybe seeing and not feeling very aligned with, and that is on Instagram particularly, identity politics is huge, because Instagram is it's not a place for like nuanced like structural analysis of the problems we're facing, it's a place where pastel infographics do well. So like, of course, you're not going to get like an accurate, fundamental critique on power structures in the UK through this platform. Like it's, I'm sure I'm sure it does exist, but in general, like that's not what you're going to see shared by hundreds of people, because it's too much work, it's too complicated, it's not shareable. So that most shallow level of like left wing, ideology will inevitably rise to the top, and become the thing that people are most sort of easily impacted by or see. And like I said, it's tricky because there's a lot of merit to those arguments. Like they are reflecting a real problem that we have, but the issue is that it's not the full picture. And I think people like yourself are feeling that when they interact with it. They're feeling like, oh, this isn't the whole picture. And then that alienates them from these left-wing ideas instead of bringing them into something greater, which is intersectional unity, intersectional solidarity, in a drive for greater equity. So yeah, I think that's sort of the main issue there, I think.
Well, this is exactly what I meant earlier on about how I've seen your own perspective develop and evolve and become this kind of, I mean, I might be wrong. I'm just explaining to you how I have perceived what you've been doing. And I do understand as well that you do use some methods of let's say, building the cause or making the cause heard through humor or through exaggeration and things like that, as a, at the end of the day, as like kind of a positive thing. But I think all that being said, the nuance that you bring to the table that I've seen from beginning to now is amazing. And I love the answer you just gave me. So yeah, so I mean, yeah, let's talk about the Instagram thing, because it's kind of all started on Instagram. What was the journey, and what was the kind of the first hint at this becoming something much more serious than an Instagram poll?
Initially, it was really just like me trying to almost like feel some sort of validation in the concerns I had about the profession. So it was, right after I'd graduated from my master's, I had spent the last 2 years on this really amazing like research program where I got to live in Tokyo for half a year. I got funding to do like interview all these people, do all this like incredible work, learn about my thesis was about the way you can facilitate alternative education. So I was able to do all these things that I felt were incredibly valuable, that I felt contributed to improving like the way that people are educated, the way that people experience education. And then after graduating, it was a bit like I was looking at all of these practices, and one part of me was frustrated because I had done the sort of prescribed route. Like I'd done my undergraduate, I worked for a year, I did my part 2, and now I was like ready to be a part 2 architectural assistant. And almost all of the roles I kept seeing were saying things like part 2 assistant with 2, 3, 4 years experience required. And I'm thinking, well, what's the point? Like, why the hell do we even have these positions that are explicitly for gaining experience? Why do we have them if practices are allowed to sort of just game the system by insisting that you stay in that role for longer so that they can get a more experienced practitioner and in most cases pay them less? So that was kind of like the trigger. And then I released a survey, which, yeah, asked people how much unpaid overtime they'd worked, how often they'd seen practices recruiting for architectural assistant positions with years of experience, if they'd felt exploited by their employers, if they had faith in the Royal Institute of British Architects. And generally, the results were very, very damning, and kind of aligned with my personal frustration with what was happening. So we asked, are you currently employed? Which 45% of people said no. So almost like 50% unemployment in architectural assistants. Bear in mind that was around the time of the pandemic, so that likely had a big part of that. Have you ever worked unpaid overtime? 89% said yes. Does your salary allow you to live comfortably? 74% said no. Have you ever seen vacancies that require architectural assistants to have years of professional experience? 93% said yes. Have you ever felt exploited by your employer in practice? 74% said yes. And do you feel supported by the Royal Institute of British Architects? 96% of people said no. So that was the original sort of impetus. And then all of the written experiences that we received as well, which we received hundreds of like written experiences about people's time in practice and frustrations with the pathway to qualification. We synthesized all of those experiences down into 5 demands, which were about ending unpaid overtime, creating more oversight for the architectural assistant role, increasing transparency in the REBA, creating more representative governing body, and more accountability for exploitative practices. So that was the journey from survey to open letter, which was the open letter was founded on those 5 demands.
And so it's at that point when you see the level of response and then the reaction by not just students and peers, but also bodies, journalistic bodies that started to take notice of the reaction, I guess, from these results, which in many ways we describe the superficiality of Instagram, but it actually played quite an important role, I imagine, in kind of getting those results and getting those infographics to go viral, right?
Yeah. Like none of this would have been possible without using social media. Like, it, like we said, it has a lot of problems, but at the end of the day, if you're an individual or a group without pre-existing institutional power, then you have to leverage power structures that already exist. And Instagram, social media is one such sort of tool that you can leverage to try and achieve that. So yeah, all of this came from the virality of the message.
And I think what I noticed, obviously many years prior to this, there's been previous campaigns done by people. I think, for example, Adam Nathaniel Furman had done a bit of activism in this cause as well, talking about unpaid internships and the kind of the working conditions for junior level architectural practitioners being very exploitative. But I sense, and I think based on the response that we saw and that you saw, was there was a brewing kind of that this issue had still not been resolved. No matter how many of the previous campaigns had been done, nothing had been done to the level at which now things are happening. And it's difficult to tell whether this is a kind of cascading effect of all the different kind of movements that happened previously, and then yours was the final domino that just kind of has now initiated change, or whether the way in which you did it, which was extremely organized. And I think you as a person are very, very well structured, and obviously you write amazing, and I think you've got a research background, so it might have just been the way in which you were curating all of this research, and I think the amount of effort and time you put into this as well, which just made it finally get to the desks of the people who could initiate some change. And I remember early on we discussed, how can there be effective change? And we were kind of debating about whether you work with the system or whether you kind of disrupt the system. And it was great for me to kind of see, not that I'm the gauge of your success, but I'm just talking from my perspective, that I loved that you took the approach of saying, well, we need to work with the system in order to change it. And that has now caused some major changes to happen as described by the ARB. So what was that next process of sort of, it got the attention and now everything is kicking off with these institutional bodies? What was that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the balance is that it's within and without, like, so some people said, for example, like, oh, if you have a problem with the REBA, why don't you run to be like student rep or counselor or something and do that? And that is an approach to trying to change the institution from within. But I personally don't have any faith in that process with an organization like the REBA, just because it's too big, it's too old, it's too set in its ways. So the way that pressure needs to be applied to an institution like that most effectively, it has to come from the outside, because then you can sort of leverage things like PR, like the reputation of people in the higher up positions in the institution, that kind of thing, and then you see rapid action take place. But then also, like, at the same time with the ARB, we hadn't really directed that much of our energy towards them, just because they're, as a much smaller organization, which is largely answerable to government, we didn't think that public opinion would have that much sway over them. But the work that we did from the outside with the REBA seems to have contributed towards internal change at the ARB. So I think, yeah, it's like an ecosystem of change. Like, you can't just do one or the other. You need it all to be happening all the time. And that's also what I think about in terms of, like, what our role is in the, like you said, the long running, like, push for change in the profession. And yeah, I think, like, an example of how much of an impact that Adam had with his critique of sort of, unpaid internships and poor conditions for graduates and students. Lots and lots and lots of people who engaged with us mentioned that as being almost like their first introduction to this topic of, like, equity in architecture. So I think that everyone that's kind of contributed to kicking down the door has, I think it is a collective effort over different organizations and over time. And yeah, I think that a big part of why it feels like there were big changes from what we did is, I think it's the fact that we were able to rely on that history. And I also think it was the unique situation that we started in. So I think it was also because it was lockdown. Lockdown and the pandemic took all different kinds of problems of inequity and exacerbated them. So it did that with architecture as well, in the way that bosses were like doing like spying on their workers through webcams. They were committing furlough fraud. They were doing all these things that were not like, it's that kind of exploitation wasn't new, but it was just exacerbated by the pandemic. So, and also, everyone was very, very online at that time as well. So we were able to have a bigger impact because of that. And yeah, so I think it's like lots and lots and lots of different factors all contributed towards it. And yeah, like I definitely can't take credit at all beyond like, yeah, like maybe we organized FAF in a good way, but other than that, there's a absolute like myriad of other factors that contributed towards what's happening right now.
Yeah, really, it really, I didn't even put that I didn't kind of place that together in my head that the pandemic was actually such a major factor in making sure everybody was in the digital space. And strangely enough, I think we were introduced and our momentum kind of, you know, we kind of bumped into each other because of that digital flux online and, creators getting together and collaborating. It was a strange time. I think that could be an episode in of itself. But, you know, as we kind of discussed before, your results then initiated the bigger institutions to get involved, and as you just described, things got to a place in which then the RIBA were influencing the ARB, but the AJ did a lot of help. They helped a lot, right? And the AJ were kind of putting your articles out there. They were putting your results, and they even carried out their own survey to kind of reflect some of the questions you guys were asking. So let's go through those quickly, and if you can, just kind of comment on some of the main statistics. So the first one was 5,850 architectural assistants are working in RIBA chartered practices. What's the kind of broader picture there?
I mean, I think this is the main reason why this is significant is just that RIBA charter practices have to play by a different set of rules to non-RIBA charter practices. So the relevance of this is that these practices have to work according to the code of practice set out by the RIBA. So, and about, as I understand it, about half of practices are RIBA chartered. So one of the critiques of, our open letter was that, like not all practices are RIBA chartered. So, you make changes to the RIBA and it won't fix the problem. And, we were kind of just like, well, yeah, but fixing 50% of the problem is still good. Like, it's not, I don't know why on earth we would ever have this like all or nothing mentality here. That's just ridiculous. So yeah, this number is mainly significant because it just shows you like how many people are in this position where the RIBA's policies directly impact their employment and their quality of life.
And this one that says sort of 48% of Part 1 architectural assistants working at RIBA practice are paid less than the real living wage, and 15% of Part 2s.
So I think out of this entire investigation, that is the most significant finding, because one of the obligations that a RIBA charter practice has is to pay all of their staff at least the real living wage. So this shows that about half of these practices are breaching their agreement.
Legal.
Not illegal, because the RIBA's not a government body, so agreements with it, they're...
Wait, sorry. So the real living wage is the
real living wage
criteria?
is not a legal criteria. No, the minimum wage is a legal criteria.
Right.
So basically the minimum wage, like, it's pretty universally accepted, is not enough for someone to live on full time.
So what is the real living wage? Do you know that?
The real living wage is a foundation, basically, and they set a figure that is seen as the minimum that you would need to earn to live on, basically. So it's calculated differently in the UK and London. So it means that it's higher than the minimum wage, and it's higher than the UK living wage, which is, so those are both government rates, so the minimum wage is literally the lowest you can pay someone legally. The UK living wage is like an aspirational figure that the government suggests is a better way to pay people, but they don't enforce that. So then the Real Living Wage Foundation, they've said, neither of these are good enough. this is what you should be paying someone for them to live at the bare minimum. So the RIBA has a policy that all of their accredited, all of their charter practices have to pay at least the real living wage, not the minimum wage, not the national living wage, but the real living wage. So what that means in terms of annual income is that no one at a RIBA charter practice should be earning less than £22,568 in London and £19,760 outside of London. So if you're at a RIBA practice in London being paid £21,000, your practice is violating their agreement with the RIBA. So that's not illegal because it's not a law. It's an agreement that the practice has made with an institutional body. So the worst that can happen is, they can lose the accreditation, basically. So that's. So it's not illegal, but it is obviously very unethical and breaching an agreement that you made, which is not great. So the significant thing about these figures is that it shows how seriously practices take their agreements with the RIBA. It shows how seriously they take the code of practice. Not seriously at all. They feel absolutely no concern about violating these agreements they've made with the RIBA, and they're evidently confident that there will be no reprisals and no consequences for doing this. So that is a really huge reason why one of our main demands was more accountability for exploitative practices, because at the moment there's next to nothing.
That's amazing. And then so 88% of full-time Part 1 and Part 2 assistants at RIBA chartered practices said they never paid overtime. And I think before you comment on this, I think from the layperson like me who says, I've been through practice, I've done that, and I think, you know what? That's nice. It'd be amazing if we got overtime, but it's not really realistic. So what do you say to that? Because I think quick point on that is when I told my wife this, she was shocked, and she's a midwife, because apparently unpaid overtime is actually not the norm.
Yeah, well, I mean, so let's just dig into that a little bit more. Why would you say it's unrealistic?
I wouldn't say it now, I'll tell you that. But I think it has a lot to do with the culture that we're kind of ingrained with in architecture school. The kind of, you gotta work till your hands bleed, and you gotta, it's got this very almost ultra capitalistic kind of feeling around it, that you got to put in the extra work. It's the kind of, without being, I don't know if this is discriminatory or anything, but the Japanese culture of you respect the master and you put in the extra work, that I think played the role, at least in my head.
Yeah, so there's a lot that we can talk about, like where this culture comes from. I really like an article by Marisa Courtwright on failed architecture, which is it talks about architecture as a calling and how people view architecture as like this greater, like a calling, which is more than a job, more than a lifestyle, and they use that as a way of justifying all kinds of exploitative, damaging behavior. So it's too much to it's too big to go into effectively here. But I would point people towards that article as like a good rundown of like culturally what the problem is. Another way that people describe paying overtime as unrealistic is that practices just can't afford to do it because, their fees are so low. And, so basically what they're saying is practices don't make enough money and the worst and the consequences of those low fees are passed down the hierarchy to the people at the bottom. So in one sense, I'm obviously, my point of view is, well, don't displace your practice's business problems to your most junior staff. First of all, that's obviously something that is wildly exploitative. But the other thing is that at the end of the day, fees are so low because architects have essentially cannibalized themselves over the last few decades in undercutting fees in order to win work. So this is a situation that the profession has like absolutely brought upon itself. People talk about the race to the bottom, and that's what's happened. So
Yeah.
The repercussions of the last few decades, the race to the bottom, the people facing the consequences for that aren't the people who participated in it. It's the people joining the profession now after the damage has been done. And the other thing I would say, just from like a strategy point of view, is that yes, practices do have low fees right now, and that is a problem, but it's evidently not enough of a problem for practice directors and practice partners to do anything about it. Because how much organized action around improving the state of the profession, improving fees do we see? Like, I don't see it. So unless I'm looking in the wrong place, I don't think it's happening enough. So if we want to create that momentum, if we want to force people in positions of power to take the problem seriously, then we need to demand better treatment of people at the bottom so they can't displace the problems onto us. Because if they can't displace the problems onto us, then they're going to have to finally deal with it. And so that's why I think things like unionization is so important, because we're basically saying, like, we're not going to be your loophole. We're not going to be your get out of jail free card anymore. You're not going to be able to pass these cost saving measures onto our salaries and onto our free time. We're saying that's done. We're not doing that anymore. You're either going to have to fix the problem or you're going to have to go out of business. And I really think that that's the only way to remedy the situation.
I think this was an issue that, again, we discussed a while ago. And I think I'm starting to realize the wisdom behind that as well now, because at the end of the day, I was always hesitant about thinking that the way to resolve what's quite obviously a business issue in some ways, it's the way in which practices organize themselves financially and the services they offer, and obviously the fees they charge, that the way to resolve that was not to go out and demand stuff or to just demand change. But my apprehension was due to the fact that I thought, we need to work and support practices more in order for them to be able to create much more lucrative business propositions for their clients in order that they can charge better fees. And the value of the architect is to be seen as something more valuable, so that there's no need for us to go down to these fees that eventually will kill us, as you said. But I now see the wisdom in what you're saying, because the first point of action should be, because it's not affecting the people at in the higher positions, especially in the way it affects us who, junior level practitioners. Yes, the first step should be that you demand that they change their behavior, that they change the way in which they structure their business as a kind of first point of action. And then they really resolve their business. So, I think this was a point that was perhaps lost to some people. And, I think you are a type of person who is trying to also bring, you talk about intersectionality, that we all need to kind of come together and look at these things from the wider picture as well, and not alienate people and kind of join forces in a way. And I think hopefully this episode will be useful for people who had some confusion about the I suppose the momentum that needs to kind of build to solve these issues. So now we kind of discussed that the action to demand change is extremely valuable. And I think the way in which you're doing it is, I commend you for it. I think you've probably been commended for it constantly. But what about the other side of it? And I think I like to think in some ways that's what I've been focused on, in terms of, we talked about, I mentioned the idea of we need to increase the value of the architect, the way in which the architectural practitioner is perceived as someone who can contribute more value than what is currently perceived. and how that would then have a knock-on effect on the business success or the economic success of practice as a, as a field, which arguably the RIBA should have some responsibility for in promoting as well. So, there's points to be said there in terms of demanding change as well. So I definitely see the kind of the value of what you're doing. However, I also think that there is a responsibility on maybe this new wave of creators or students who have recently emerged to also educate the wider public, to educate the current students and the future students about the possibility of architectural education being more than just designing a building. And for me, that's something that I take a lot of pride in. Obviously, this whole podcast is dedicated to that, looking at the multidisciplinary potential of architecture. And you are an esteemed guest of mine because of what you're doing as well. You've taken your architectural education, and you yourself are pursuing unique paths in the field that I think would also raise the value of the architect. So tell me about the whole business opportunity in this as well.
So I think it links a lot to some of the topics I covered in the last Reba J article I did, which has generated a bit more like Twitter arguments than I was expecting, but I think that's probably a good thing because it means more people are reading it, so I can't complain. But so basically in this article, I talk about the way that the title is currently operating in the profession. And the reason why I look specifically at the title is because at the end of the day, that's the end of your qualification journey. You don't get any protection of function. You don't get to work or practice in any different way because of the title. All you get is the title. So it's really interesting to me to deconstruct, like, why then are we so precious about this thing that literally confers no advantage onto us? And, people can argue that, oh, well, it's the implied value of the title that we're pushing for. It's the respect that you get when people know that you're an architect. That is blatantly untrue. Like, if that was the case, the profession would have so much more value than it does right now. If that was the case, we wouldn't have to be not paying our employees to run a feasible business model. So that, like, as just to start off with, that is evidently not true. The idea that to be an architect,
but when you say it's
confers
untrue,
some kind of value on you. Yeah.
But who is the perceptor, if you like, or who is perceiving that value in that argument? Are we saying that architects, are you arguing that no, people, the lay people, the public don't see architects as this big thing as we'd like to think we are? Or are you saying that the profession doesn't see architects in this esteemed way?
I'm talking about the public. I'm talking about the public and clients. They might think of us as being big, influential, important people, because a lot of the time we get conflated with developers, but they don't see value, is what I mean. And that's why it's so difficult. And the reason why I say that that's the people don't see architects as having value, why I say that that's a fact, and why I say that the perception of the title as conferring value is blatantly untrue, because if that was the case, we wouldn't have such a huge problem with unpaid overtime in the profession. We wouldn't have so many practices struggling financially. We wouldn't have these absolutely scraping the barrel fees in order to win work.
Yeah, I definitely see the logic in why you believe that, and why you're saying it's blatant. But I know this is a crude example to give, but I went and interviewed random people on the street about the perception of architects and asked them about things that you could relate to, I guess, factors that imply value, for example, salary, for example, the effect of architectural projects, and the results were actually different to, I think, what you're describing, in the sense that nearly every single person I'd interviewed, and I know you'd need to do more scientific, that's why I say it's a crude example, but every single person thought architects earned around 60 to 80,000. Sometimes they were going into the hundreds. And when I asked them after, the kind of surface level kind of response was, well, yeah, you guys are in charge of the public, the public realm. You guys are people who create the spaces we live in. So there's a discrepancy there, don't you think?
Yeah, well, one, like, that perception, again, is not true. Architects are only responsible for a very small percentage of the built environment. And even then, they have to play within the realms of policy, regulations, things like that. And perceived value is not the same as like actual value. Like, we can see actual value in salaries. We can see actual values in the way that architects are paid. So that is our like economic value in the wider system right now. And
so I think it's important to say then that your point about how architects are not seen as this kind of esteemed profession or esteemed title, I think applies more accurately to the people actually who do determine our success and value, which in a strange way I actually don't think the public has that much of an effect on our value, because usually these clients and the jobs are won through other players, other sub-professions and professions, for example, the ones you name, like developers and various contractors. So you're right, but I think this needs to be applied to those specific, let's say, the interdisciplinary fields, and those developers, those contractors, those engineers who don't see us as valuable. I think you're right, but I think this applies to people who work with architects. They don't see our value at all. And
well, I think there's two sides to it, because one is so I'm talking like material value. I'm not really talking too much about like perception. I'm talking about like material value, and material value is determined by how much you are compensated for the work that you're doing. So when I say that the title confers value on us is blatantly untrue, what I mean is that our salaries are like abysmal considering the amount of time we train to do this job. So that's what I mean by it's blatantly untrue.
But who determines that salary being abysmal?
Well, that's just, what do you mean? Like, who decides if,
I guess what I'm trying to say is
it's a bad salary?
I guess what I'm trying to say is I believe it's more as a result of the negative way or the lowly way in which people within our field, for example, contractors, engineers, and developers, the way they see our value as opposed to the public. And
well, so yeah, no. So this is what I was going to say. This is why I say it's in two parts. So yes, there is that the construction industry has huge sway over what that value is. But the reason why I still think public perception is poor and public perception is important is because that's what we used to rely on for 50% of our work. So in 1976, 49% of all UK architects worked for the public sector. So that means that they were paid with public money and their work went towards public projects. So they were involved in like social housing. They were involved in creating public amenities, in creating infrastructure. Their work directly impacted public life, and their work was publicly funded. So the public perception of architecture was obviously a lot more well-informed because they could directly see the result of the work, and they could directly see how the architect was actually performing this role of like placemaking and creating the city in the way that we like to imagine they still do. Then, fast forward to today, that number is 0.7% now work in the public sector. So architects 99% of the time work for private clients, and our actual impact on the built environment has been drastically reduced because we're not working for the public anymore. We're working for individuals, or we're working for private organizations. That's why half of the things we see in the AJ now are just fancy kitchen extensions. Like, no shade to the practices working on that. Like, you do what you got to do, but like, that's all it is. Like, it's all kitchen extensions everywhere. And that really, for me, is what I talk about when I mean, that's really what I mean when I talk about public perception of architecture is really poor right now, because architecture has a very limited impact or relevance on public life. It's been privatized like almost entirely. So that's that. So there's two kinds of value here. There's the value in the way we're paid, which is poor, in the way that we in the rates that we can expect and the fees that we can expect from clients, which are poor. So the title's not helping us there. And then our work has no relevance to the public. So there's a very poor public perception of architecture. So it's sort of not working on both of these fronts. And so the point I make in the article is that we have this idea that the title confers some advantage on us, when really, like, it doesn't really. Like, it might a bit. Like, I'm not saying that there's no use to it, but I'm just saying that it's really, really, really not worth the amount of effort we put into getting it.
Yeah, I just have to grill you on some points, and I think you replied brilliantly there. I think also the fact that you're using the metric of, or at least the comparison of the level of public work, the drastic reduction in that as well. I think that's a good metric to kind of make the conclusion that our public perception has also been detrimentally affected as well. So no, that's brilliant. And I think to kind of go further on your point as well in that article, the role of, calling yourself the title of architect actually has no real effect and has no standing. And I think one kind of anecdotal evidence to contribute to that as well is, I think probably after my part one, I was being referred to as architect by friends, family, by people, whatever, in the other activities I was doing outside of work. And it got to a point where I felt like the only person who was looking at the title of architect with esteem, because I was saying, no, I'm not an architect yet. Trust me. I will be that esteemed one day. But they were like, oh, but you do architecture, right? I was like, yeah. So you're an architect? I was like, no. So I definitely
most
get your point.
Most people don't care. Like, and I feel like beyond obviously the need to regulate like safety and things like that, I don't think they should care. Like, I think thinking of architects as people who design buildings and who like help influence the built environment, I think that's fine. I think if that's your idea of what an architect is, I think that's fine. Like, that's what it is, like like you said, the people who fixate on the technicalities of the title are us. Like, no one else cares. And so so basically, like, the argument that I make in the article is that right now we have a very, very strictly codified definition of what an architect is. And we have a very bureaucratized, rigid way that you become an architect officially. This process is incredibly exclusive. We can look at data from undergraduate to part one, to postgraduate, to part two, to architect. And what we see is that like throughout that process, non-white people basically drop out at every part of the process. And again, that's not purely an ethnicity thing. That's to do with the like the likelihood of people from non-white backgrounds to be living in like poverty, for example. That, you know, like I said, it's all interconnected. So that is also a reflection on the way that the qualification process is exclusive in terms of class, in terms of disability. It's exclusive in along all of these axes. And we can see that in the way that the demographics change throughout the education process. So that's the way it works right now. It's very rigid, it's very bureaucratized, takes a bloody long time. There's loads of opportunities for people to exploit you in that process. For what? For basically nothing. For basically a title that confers you no protection of function. It's kind of a poison chalice. So essentially, the way I see it, there's two ways to try and increase the value of the title and increase the value of the profession. One way is through regulation. You give architects protection of function. You say, okay, architects, you're the only ones who can sign off on like planning proposals, and you have sort of this figurehead position of the built environment. You know, a developer can't do anything unless it goes through you. That's one way of doing it. It's through regulation. I don't really ever see that happening. Another way could be through fixed fees. So in the 70s and early 80s.
Why don't you see that? Why don't you see that ever happening? And I mean, this is something that has obviously it is something that exists in different parts of the world and quite successfully. But why do you think that wouldn't happen?
I don't see it happening because of the current political climate of the UK. We've had the Conservatives in power for 11 years, and you know their defining characteristics is that they believe in free trade and like unfettered like market capitalism. So regulation goes against their like party ethos. So I don't think that we can look to and also like mass house builders, developers who build a lot of houses and make a bunch of money off building a lot of houses. A lot of them are Tory party donors. A lot of them are Tory party members.
I would love to see a statistic of what proportion of the architectural built environment is being built by qualified architects. Do you know it? Do you know that roughly?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I'm sure we could find it, and I'm sure it would be very low.
Especially
very, very
with
low.
What you just mentioned with regards to how much of a monopoly the developers have on this sector.
Yeah, and there's not even that many like big developers as well. There's like a handful of them that do like the vast majority of house building in in the UK. And again, that's why the quality of so much of it is so poor. But yeah, so one way which, like I said, I don't really think is likely under the current government or even under the current opposition to the government is regulation. Another type of regulation that people also talk about a lot is fixed fees. So we used to have fixed fees that basically said, you know, your fee as an architect should be this, it can't be below this. And it meant that we had a lot of value at that time because the fixed fees were like, they were good fees. Then Margaret Thatcher got rid of that because it was perceived as like, you know, acting like a monopoly, and like it wasn't perceived as being as part of the free market. So those were abandoned, and that began our gradual race to the bottom to where we are now. So some people talk about reintroducing fixed fees. I also don't think there's any likelihood of that happening either. So if we rule out regulation as a way of increasing our value, then what does that leave us with? I think what that leaves us with is generating more value by bringing in and capitalizing on a more diverse range of talent and a more diverse range of people and experiences. So I think if we want to increase value, we need to do more things. We need to expand our idea of what an architect can do. So I personally like the idea of architects owning their specialities more. So I love the idea of architects being able to own being an expert on like retrofit and climate action, for example. I love the idea of an architect being able to uh, have a huge presence in like academia or policy and still be an architect. Um, Obviously, there's details within that system that you'd have to iron out in terms of like, yeah, if you have an architect who's fully invested in like policy and academia, maybe you don't want them drawing a door detail. Like, obviously, there's nuances in the way that this would be organized. But I think if we embrace the plurality of what it means to be an architect and we let go of this very outdated, like very rigid understanding of what you need to do and be to be an architect, I think value will increase because architects will have more application beyond what we currently have. So that's kind of why I am so interested and excited by what the ARB are currently doing, because they're planning these most ambitious reforms to the education system in 50 years. And their main priority is improving diversity in the profession, both in terms of who can qualify and in terms of what they can do to qualify. So that, to me, is a really encouraging step in the right direction. And that, to me, is the most likely avenue through which we're going to increase the value of architects and the profession.
Yeah, this is music to my ears because, as I said, from day one of me coming out of my part one, this was my focus. And I think what you've done is now present an extremely robust case of why this is the way forward. And I remember we used to debate these things, and I had said to you, I think quite early on, that the solution to this is for us to embrace a more almost, I mean, maybe the way I was phrasing it wasn't the right way, but to think about the way in which the architectural field can diversify the service it offers and the roles that it kind of attaches to. And that's, again, Two Worlds Design podcast is about exploring the multidisciplinary potential of architecture. You were mentioning people who said you'd be inspired to see people who were architects, but they were also in the fields of politics by embracing their specialisms, or climate change and climate action. And this is, episode 1 of the Two Worlds Design podcast with Shahid Salim. We've got an architect acting as a kind of historical scholar who's also an acclaimed professor, making incredible moves in the redefinition of sacred space in this country. We've got episode 2 with Adam Nathaniel Furman, who, architecturally educated, goes off and in some ways is activist as well, but incredibly acclaimed designer all round now with furniture and interiors. And I can go on. And now you, someone who is going to be making big moves in this field and wider. So I think what you've done, as I said, is provide a robust case and a kind of you've initiated the bigger players to act on this now. And I think the changes that you described that the ARB will be putting in place, of diversifying the qualification and who it's accessible to, but also what type of people can and what type of professions and skill sets can qualify for architectural, kind of hitting the criteria for architects. This is a huge change in our industry. I believe for like the last half century, nothing this significant has happened. And I'm eager to see how they're going to do this, because it's not going to be an easy task. Do you have any details on what you think will happen specifically? For example, like because the courses themselves, I would argue, are actually very, very well, set up for incredible diversity. I mean, just recently, I was just kind of prowling through the works of I believe his name's George Hinson, who was a graduate from Arthur Mamumani, who actually I interviewed on the podcast episode 7, who took his architectural education and learning about scalable systems and using data-driven technology through his parametric design inspirations in Design Studio 10 at Westminster, and then went on to create Toad, which was an AI system for finding good signage and documenting all the signage opportunities in London and the country, actually. And then he actually went on to Dragon's Den and was able to then show the entire world the value that architectural education can give you. So, there's some level of me thinking, this is brilliant, let's see what they do, but also thinking, don't change too much, because actually the way in which our education system is set up does allow for a very diverse outcome.
Yeah, I don't think it's about changing what's there. I think it's about increasing choice. So at the moment, although individual tutors and studios might have diverse briefs and interests and things like that, structurally, the education is very homogenous. Structurally, you all have to jump over the same hurdles, do the same types of modules, and do the same type of work experience. So that, that homogeneity does not create the type of diverse, widely valuable profession that we're talking about. It might in isolated cases, sure. But if we're talking about system change, if we're talking about large scale change, then we need these large scale reforms. So I don't think it's about looking at the current model of architectural education and saying that's wrong. I think it's about looking at it and saying it's not working for everyone. So what we need is, I think, more universities to experiment with different structural arrangements of architectural education, like the LSA, for example, or like apprenticeships. I think we need to take that and do more of it, because at the moment, these alternative pathways are very much the minority. And every new architecture school seems to sort of just like rinse and repeat the structure of the current dominant model of architectural education, which I don't think is helping anyone. So yeah, that's sort of my hope for what the ARB does. But obviously they are a government body, or they're not a government body, but the government tells them what to do. They're an autonomous body that the government tells what to do, and they have to make a case for all of the reforms that they want to do. So a huge factor in how ambitious they're going to be able to be is how many people respond to this survey that they have out and that doesn't close until January of 2022. So the more people calling for more diversity, more routes to qualification, more sort of space for specialization in the profession, the more we get that, the more likely it is that these reforms are going to be ambitious and make real system change in the profession. So
the more evidence they'll have.
Exactly. And the stronger their case will be. So that's why, since they opened the survey, like a month ago, or whatever it's been, we've pretty much just been like banging the drum about this constantly, because it is potentially the most important survey you may ever do. So it's a really big deal, and we really need to get as many people as possible contributing to this thing and making this need for change evident.
Yeah. And I've done the survey. It doesn't take long at all. It's like 5 or 10 minutes. So I would highly encourage everyone to do it for the reasons Charlie's mentioned. I'll leave a link in the description so that you can just go and do that survey straight away. But yeah, in terms of the actual changes we're talking about, you described some of those, like just having more flexibility and allowing there to be more choice. I remember I did a talk at Westminster about, does university education need to change? And it left me in a very strange conclusion, saying, look, I don't know how it's going to change, but all I know is there needs to be more flexibility. So I reached that same conclusion based on the kind of the responses I was getting from people as well, and just my experience from speaking to so many incredible people on this podcast. Was, yeah, like the LSA is a brilliant example, because the LSA is facilitating an apprenticeship focused route to architectural qualification. But where are the other ones? Where are the schools which are, and this might be a controversial one, but I do know that there is a good chunk of people who would love to be strictly in the BIM world, strictly in the developer construction world. And maybe there should be a school that specializes specifically in building integrated management technology and construction and all about the built world. And and then maybe we can actually then access those markets again and take hold of a big part of the built construction industry that we kind of lost throughout history. So this has been amazing. It's been amazing for many reasons, because I think we speak often, but we haven't been able to really sit down for an hour or two and discuss these things in depth. I really hope we can talk more in the future. There's so much more we can talk about and we should talk about. And I just want to kind of make sure we get the important issues heard. So, I'll do my best to make sure this podcast is heard by everyone, because I think what you're doing is so important. And you've got my full support, and I think everybody should kind of get behind the movement here. So is there anything else you want to say? Anything going on with the FAF now that you want to kind of get out there? Or
yeah, nothing sort of immediate, but we're working with UVW SAW at the moment to produce another open letter, this time directed at architecture job boards. And the open letter is all about trying to pressure them into making salary transparency a required aspect of advertising on their job board. Because at the moment, that figure we saw earlier, about 50% of part ones being paid less than the real living wage, one way that is enabled is through a lack of salary transparency. So it's a really, really important topic, and one that, has relevance to all professions, all jobs, not just architecture. So that's in the works right now. And yeah, if you go to fa.front on Instagram, that's where we'll post updates on that.
And we'll leave a link and leave all the links in the description as well, so you guys can go check them out. And I just would like to finish with something a little bit more, I guess, one-to-one to the people who are listening, because most of the people listening are young practitioners, they're students of architecture, they're people who do believe in this vision and have believed in this vision for a long time now, that we need to look at the outcome of architectural education and the architectural skills in a much more open way. What advice would you give people who are starting out in this profession now? And as someone who's just kind of reached, let's say, the end of the education and in kind of what is about to change, what would you advise somebody right now who's just about to consider getting into architectural education, or who's just started?
I think I'd probably say that the way we're educated largely, and the way we're taught to practice, is very individualistic. It relies entirely on this sense of competition, this idea that for you to win, someone else has to lose. It's presented as a zero-sum game. And that is how a lot of business, that is how a lot of practice works, but it's not sustainable. If we keep educating and if we keep practicing in this way, we will continue to see negative repercussions to that. So my advice would be to push back against any anything in education or practice that tries to break down solidarity and connections with your peers, because the best hope we have for achieving the system change that we've been talking about over the last hour is through collective action, through solidarity, and through large-scale grassroots pressure on people in positions of power. So that connection to peers, that connection with your communities and the people around you, that is not just nice, it is potentially the most important source of your power within the profession. So value it as such.
That's incredibly inspiring, Charlie, and I think very apt advice as well for a profession, the kind of profession we're part of as well. So it's been a pleasure, mate. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'm sure there'll be more episodes to come because we have a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, no, can't wait, man. Thank you.
Cool, guys. All right, guys, see you guys on the next episode.